Hey folks, welcome back. I'm just picking right up where I left off on that last video, and I'm going to drop you right back in where I just finished cleaning up the shop prior to taking this thing apart and getting started working on this mechanical fuel injection. Well, I had to take a moment and clean my mess up here, but now that I've got that done, we can dive into this mechanical fuel injection. Just a forewarning, I'm not going to, have an in-depth seminar on my vast knowledge of mechanical fuel injection. And that is simply because I do not have a vast knowledge of mechanical fuel injection. I have a pretty good idea on the theory behind it, how it works. I know how most of the components in this particular system here work. And I just want to share what I know there and take the opportunity to show you guys the inside and how some of those parts work. If you have an interest in all things mechanical, maybe by the end of this segment you will have a better idea of how a basic mechanical injection system works. On the other hand, if you're watching this video and you're considering putting mechanical fuel injection on your own engine, maybe by the time we're done here you will have a better baseline than I had when I started doing this stuff many years ago. Now before we get started, I'll take you over to the truck and we'll take a look at all of the individual components before we remove anything or take any of this stuff apart. Just going to jump right into it here. We'll start out on the driver's side of the truck just because it's easier to see a couple of these parts. So obviously you got to have a place to put your fuel, and this is my fuel cell. This one here holds about 40 gallons. And there's a little trickery going on in it. So this is the fuel pickup right back there. And I know that just looks like a weld-in bung, and it's kind of odd to pick your fuel up at the front of the fuel cell. However, that is the end of a piece of 1.5-inch tube that actually goes clear to the back of the fuel cell. That way when you accelerate and your fuel transfers or sloshes to the back of the fuel cell, you're still going to pick up fuel. And the reason I use such a large tube in there, my theory is if you stand on the brakes, all of that fuel starts migrating forward or sloshing forward in the tank. At least you'll have that capacity of that 1-inch tube to keep feeding the engine and keep it from going lean until your fuel kind of levels out or settles back out. I haven't had a chance to really test that yet, but that's my theory on it anyway. Now, moving on from the fuel cell and the pickup, this little black square box here is the fuel shutoff valve. You can see that little nut there. That is so you can put a 1/2-inch wrench on there and shut the fuel off. Now I'm actually going to build a handle that goes on that for emergency fuel shutoff, make that easier. Next in line is this filthy black anodized housing, and that is the fuel filter, the primary fuel screen. And all that is in there is an O-ring and a screen. It's a little bit bigger than what you'd find in your screen door, but basically all that thing is doing is catching the rocks and keeping that from, big parts from going through your pump and plugging up nozzles. Then you've got this here is a number 12-12 feed line. It goes underneath the radiator and it goes to the fuel pump. Now this is an Enderly 110 fuel pump. And there are several different sizes, several different brands. Maybe we'll try and get into that a little bit later, but this is just what's on this truck right now. That thing there and knowing what it flows is very important to your fuel system. This one is driven off of the camshaft, as we talked before while building the engines. Now we'll move on to the passenger side. Here we are on the passenger side of the engine. And next in line after the fuel pump is your fuel shutoff valve. So this control cable here actually goes into the cab of the truck, and that is so the driver can turn the fuel on and off. This is like basically a 3-way valve. You have an inlet from the pump, and when the fuel is turned on, it will come up this hose up to the barrel valve. When you shut the fuel off, this is the off position. This is actually on. So when you shut the fuel off, that diverts fuel from the pump to a return line that goes back to the tank. And that is basically, so when you shut that fuel pump off, you're not deadheading the pump. It just starts circulating the fuel back to the tank and quits feeding fuel to the engine. Now, as we move on up, our fuel line comes up here to the barrel valve. This particular barrel valve here is what is called an Enderle square valve. Some people call it the Enderle cube. This is kind of an older design, but still plenty adequate for just about any application, really. They have a K valve, which is the old nitro valve, and then now they have a nitro barrel valve, which is just a newer, updated version of a K valve. You can go on for days on different components and different styles, different updates. This one here is an Enderle square valve, and it's kind of old school, but I like them. They're simple and they work good. Now, in the barrel valve, you actually have your spool. That is what this arm here is mounted on. So when you open the throttle blades, you can see that turnbuckle rotates that spool. When we get all of this off of here, I will take this apart and show you what's going on in there. Behind this plug is your main pill. So the way mechanical fuel injection works, your pump pumps fuel up to the barrel valve. Your barrel valve meters how much fuel is going to the engine and how much fuel is going back to tank. Whatever does not return to tank goes in the engine. So that's the basics of it. Like I said, behind this plug is your main pill. So your main pill is going to determine how much fuel goes back to tank. So it's kind of the opposite of a carburetor. So if you want your engine to run richer with a carburetor, you're going to put a bigger jet in it or a bigger set of jets. On this setup, if you put a bigger main pill in here or a bigger main jet, that's going to let more fuel go back to the tank, less fuel go to the engine. So you got to remember that. Bigger main pill, leaner the engine runs. This right here is your idle poppet. So this is basically like a check valve that has a spring and a seat and some shims in there, and you're going to set that shim and that seat up to what pressure you want the fuel system to set at idle. Probably the most common is 5 psi. So this thing is going to maintain 5 psi. Anything over 5 psi at idle is going to return fuel to this line, which also goes back to tank. This is also the return line that when you go wide open throttle and you're running on the main pill, whatever is not going to the engine is returning back through this line as well. Again, like I said, we will go over this more when I actually take some of this stuff apart. You got the hat, or as referred to as the injector. This one here is actually a bird catcher. As far as this style right here, there are 3 different sizes. You have a bug catcher, a bird catcher, and a buzzard catcher. And as you can imagine, that name pertains to the size of the injector itself. Back here you have a distribution block, and all that is the fuel that is coming out of the barrel valve is coming up this line into a distribution block, and there's nothing special in there. It's just a galley that allows fuel to run in these lines. There's a set of these lines on each side of the hat, which feeds these nozzles. So your nozzles, which are kind of back behind these little filters I've got on here, you actually have 2 components there. Let's see if I can get it to focus now. If you can see the black, this black portion right here, that is actually the nozzle holder, and then you have the nozzle. And the nozzle itself is actually sized. You get them in different sizes, so it's kind of like a jet itself. And then you've got the tube nut. I think that's pretty much the basics of the major components on here. So now what I'm going to do is pull the hat. I'm going to pull the whole hat, the whole injector, off of the blower. And all I have to do to actually remove this stuff, I have to unhook the throttle cable on that side of the engine, pull my fuel feed line, this return line, and 4 bolts, and that whole unit comes right off the blower. Really simple, really easy to work on. So I'll set you up on the table, get a little bit of time lapse. I'll start taking some stuff apart. If you've already got your tools out, it's easily less than 5 minutes to have this thing off the engine and sitting on the bench. And speaking of sitting on the bench, since we have this thing here, and I had one on hand, I thought it would be cool to do a little comparison. Like I said, that is a bird catcher, and this here is what they call a buzzard catcher. The next size up from that would be what they refer to as a big and ugly. I'm going to go put that one back on the shelf where it belongs, and then we'll get to tearing this one apart. And if anybody's wondering how come I don't run the buzzard catcher instead of a bird catcher, first of all, you're going to have to make gobs of power to overrun a bird catcher. That thing is capable of supporting a lot of power. I mean, I know today we got guys out there running in 3,000-4,000 horsepower. But that thing will support anything I will ever build. It's just a good, solid piece. The buzzard catcher is also a great piece. There's nothing wrong with that. And it's obviously capable of supporting more power. But the thing is, most of the time what I do, a little bit of drivability goes a long ways. I like to have a little bit of throttle control. And the bigger you make those throttle blades, the more twitchy it gets. The bird catcher, I just like the way they look, so I stick with that. I picked that thing up because it was a smoking deal. Someday somebody will need it, and I'll have one sitting on the shelf. So I'm gonna go put it away, and we'll get to taking that bird catcher apart. I've got this barrel valve all disassembled. So now we can see all of the parts that are inside and what they are doing in there. So we'll start with basically the idle poppet. So I had mentioned earlier that this is like a check valve. It technically is not a check valve, and it does not function as a check valve. But if you put it in backwards, it will not flow fuel. So you have to keep that in mind. Some of them are marked what direction the fuel flows. This one is not. I don't believe either one of them that I have are not. But I have this black anodized aluminum idle poppet all disassembled here so you can see what's inside of it. Basically, you have the body and you have the poppet, and this tapered seal area here, all it does is seat in the body down there. So it drops down in place, and then you have springs, one spring and a shim. Could be any number of shims. Basically, the way you change the idle fuel pressure is with different shims, different springs. They actually make kits that you can buy that have lots of different springs, multiple shims, and everybody has their own theory on how much idle fuel pressure you need. Normally from Enderle, they're going to tell you 5 psi. I've read or heard of guys that maybe have small cooling capacity. You know, they want to richen it up at idle to try and cool the engine down. I've heard of those being up around 7.5 psi. I've heard of guys running 10, 12 psi. I don't know the magic number. I usually shoot for anywhere between 5 and 7. If I can get it in there, I think a guy can work with that pretty good. Anyway, to reassemble this unit, you've got the poppet down there in the body. I've dropped a shim down in there on top of the poppet, and then this spring goes in, and it's holding that little spool, that poppet down in against the seat. Then the other end of the body just threads on. It's got an O-ring on it that seals it. You can see this one, whoever I bought it from, it's marked as 5. I'm sure that's a 5 psi poppet. And as I went together, you can see how that thing would work as a check valve. So normally your fuel would flow through here. Once it reaches 5 psi, it's going to bypass and return to tank through this port here. If you were to put that in upside down, your fuel pressure will be driving that poppet in against the seat, and it's not going to flow fuel. So now, there is the idle poppet, and its function is to maintain fuel pressure from basically the outlet of the pump clear to your nozzles, or at least into the spool of the barrel valve. Just looking for a consistent, enough pressure to flow fuel at idle. Now inside of the barrel valve here, we've got the spool, and all of these components basically just keep the spool in place and seal up the barrel valve. You can see there's the end plate, and there's an O-ring on the end of the spool here. This O-ring seals in the bore. You've got the end plug, has the same O-ring, and then there's this spring. So on the other side of the barrel valve here, we've got a snap ring groove, just like this side here. So there's 2 snap rings. You'll have a snap ring, this plug, then this spring, this end plate here, this snap ring, and then your arm. Now to go into more detail on the spool itself, they're specific to what type of fuel you run. So if you're running methanol or gasoline, there is a difference in the spool itself. And primarily it has to do with this notch right here. That notch is basically your idle fuel. And this is probably a good point to get into flow path, how the fluid flows through the barrel valve. So you have an inlet fitting that's coming in the back of the block here. And when this spool is installed in the barrel valve correctly, there's a notch on the end of it. I don't know if you can see that. That notch is normally you start out about the 12 o'clock position. I have everything upside down. So we're going to go 6 o'clock. And in that position, that's just going to make sure that you have it oriented. You're not 180 degrees out or way off base. Now, if we look at this, in that position, fuel is going to come in that fitting, and it's going to hit this open window in the spool. There's a couple of ports in there. Fuel not only comes into this passage here and fills this window, basically filling this whole cavity. It also, there's a port here that goes all the way down, and it comes over and ties into this port right here. And then this passage where the idle check goes also comes down this side. So basically fuel is filling this whole block. And all you're doing is blocking passages and opening passages to divert where that fuel goes. So as the fuel comes in, it's filling this spool and this cavity. It's flowing around here. And once everything is full and it reaches 5 psi, it begins returning back to the tank. And this entire portion of the system is maintaining your 5 psi if that's what your poppet is set at. Now, at idle, this little slot that I mentioned earlier is what is letting fuel go to your nozzles in the hat. So as you can imagine, at 5 psi pressure and this little slot right here, there's really not much fuel getting up there to the nozzles. And when this link here is connected to this arm, you're adjusting this link and changing the relationship of this slot to the port that feeds the distribution block and the nozzles. So as you rotate that, you're basically just getting more and more, you know, if you're leaning it out, you're rolling it around to where the tapered portion of that slot, it just starts blocking that slot off in the port. So you're just giving the engine less and less fuel. And if it needs to richen up, you would adjust that link to where you're opening more and more of the slot up, allowing more fuel to go to the distribution block and the nozzles. So that is basically your idle adjustment and what you're doing. I should also mention there's another hole right here. And this hole, when you're using the slot and you're doing that adjustment on the slot, this hole here is lined up with a passage that is going directly to this passage with the idle poppet. So it doesn't have to travel all the way around the internals of the barrel valve to get to the idle poppet. It's pretty much just straight shot through the barrel valve. It is filling it, and it still has to maintain whatever pressure your poppet's set at. But it does have a direct shot to the idle poppet. And once I get this thing all back together and on the truck, I will show that more. I won't be able to show you the slot or the internal parts, but I'll be able to show you more of what it's actually doing. Now, you've got your idle set. You're happy with how much fuel the engine's getting. You go off idle. Back to opening the birdies. This link is pushing on that arm and it's rotating this barrel valve, this spool in here. Now you're no longer running on this slot because this whole wide open window lines up with this port that is going to the distribution block. Also, this little port here, this little hole that was lined up with this passage, blocks that passage off. Now, everything that is going into this block is either going to the nozzles or around through the pill, your jet that I mentioned earlier, and whatever can get through the pill is going to go through the poppet, which is already wide open, and returning to tank. So really, it's not very far off idle. Everything at that point is basically determined by your pump flow and your main jet. And really, that's the vast majority of how this unit works. There's really not much to it. You're able to tune a little bit for your idle, and you can change that pill right there, that main jet, for how much fuel goes back to tank. Whatever does not go back to your fuel tank has to go to the distribution block and to your nozzles. I'm probably not doing the best job at explaining how all of this stuff works, but at least you get to see the inside of this deal and actually what the function is. It's kind of tricky to answer questions when there's nobody here to ask them. What I'm going to do next is finish cleaning this thing up, get it all reassembled, and then we'll bolt the hat back on the engine, and I will go through basically the initial settings of where you would put this thing at prior to your initial first startup. We'll go through setting the barrel valve and the butterflies and all of that, and then maybe if I have time, we'll go ahead and fire this thing up again and see if I've made any difference or any improvement from the last time that it ran. Couple more things before I bolt this hat back on the truck. Figured I would show you guys these nozzle holders and how they're actually notched to create a spray pattern here in the hat. There are various different nozzle holders. Some of them are straight through, so they don't have that notch. They would just spray the fuel straight out of the nozzle. And of course, these ones here are like a notched or a deflector style. Also, these nozzle holders here, especially on the hat, I'll have to flip it over and show you, but these actually have a hole in the body. And I do believe that does a couple of things. One, it's basically like an emulsion hole. So it's helping introduce some air into your fuel as it's being injected. And then the other side of it, this whole area here, when the throttle blades are closed, the inside of this hat is in a negative pressure or under suction or under vacuum, however you want to look at it. So if this is completely sealed up, as that blower is pulling air in here and you've got it stopped up with the birdies closed, these lines also will be under low pressure. It'll be trying to suck everything out of those lines when the birdies are closed. So I also believe that the holes in the nozzle holders are keeping it from, putting low pressure in these fuel lines here. Another thing is mounting. These are mounted on the blower with 4 bolt holes, and on both the bird catcher and the buzzard catcher, these 2 front mounting holes are actually behind the birdies. So to install this thing, you actually have to open the birdies up and reach through here to get to the mounting bolts. And I've seen people ask before, on all of the hats that I've seen from Enderly, this style, the buzzard catcher and the bird catcher normally have dimples right here in the casting, and those dimples are in line with those mounting holes behind the birdies. So what I've always done is drilled and tapped those dimples out to a number 6 Boss O-ring thread, and then use these fancy little plugs to plug the holes. Now what that does is it gets access to where you can actually reach through the hole with your extension. You still have to reach through the birdies and get your socket on the nut or on your bolt, whatever you're using to fasten the hat down. And you have to get your socket in there, and then you can reach through with this and actually operate your ratchet on the outside of the hat. That actually makes a pretty big difference. You only have to wrestle in there elbow deep in that thing if you can fit with a gear wrench or a ratchet inside that hat, and then you want to make a change. So you're probably thinking that's pretty dangerous. It'd be pretty easy to drop your socket or the nut or a tool of some kind in your blower. That'd ruin your day. So that is why you run a screen gasket between the hat and the blower. Then if something gets away from you, it's just laying in there. You don't have to worry about nothing getting down in your blower. Still very possible to drop something small, but you have no reason to have anything that small in there, I don't think. That's enough rambling for now. I'm going to put this thing on time lapse and get some stuff bolted back together. As you can see, I got the hat back on the blower, and I think I've got everything set up here in a good place to show you how to leak down this barrel valve. However, I did want to go over something that's really important. Before you do any tuning or any setup on this stuff, you're going to need a baseline tune-up from somebody. Now, if you're fortunate enough to buy a brand new Enderly setup from a distributor like Alky Digger or Good Vibrations, somebody like that, they're probably going to spec that to your engine. Now, they're going to require some information so that they can put this system together properly. Most importantly, they're probably going to ask cubic inches, compression ratio, what size your blower is. If you already have a fuel pump, they're going to want to know the numbers on the fuel pump, flow numbers for your fuel pump, and the drive ratio on that fuel pump. You know, for example, my fuel pump runs off the front of the camshaft, so it is a 0.5 drive ratio. It turns half the speed of the engine. Now, if you're buying a new kit and they're supplying the pump with that kit, they're already going to know those flow numbers. But that stuff is very, very important, and you're not going to want to just rely on what that pump is advertised for. I'll drag out my spare pump here in a little bit and show you. I sent that into Enterly, had them freshen it up. They flow it, and when it comes back, it comes with a flow tag. I'll show you that in a bit. Now, if you're like me and you don't go buy a whole brand new complete system, rather piecemeal it together like this thing, you're going to buy a hat for a good deal here, pick up a barrel valve and a turnbuckle, you know, change the butterfly blades in it, and just, you know, cobble this thing together, you're still going to need a baseline tune-up from somebody. Me personally, I try to buy all of my parts from Good Vibrations Motorsports because they're right over the hill in Whittier, California. I get my stuff in a couple of days, and they've always treated me really good since about 2005 is the first time I talked to those folks, and they really took care of me at that time. So what I will do is I will reach out to them, give them the specs on whatever combination I'm putting together, and then get a baseline tune-up from them. You know, what nozzles they suggest and what pill to start with. And then, of course, I will buy those parts from them. And when they show up, I can put everything together, and then you can start setting stuff like your idle poppet and the barrel valve leak down. And that is what we're going to do right now. I'm going to set the camera up there and try and get it right in there where you can see what is actually going on. That is one of the things that I've always kind of been disappointed with so far on YouTube. I've researched these videos a lot, just trying to gain knowledge on it. And there are some very knowledgeable people out there that have, you know, pretty good videos. The problem I usually find with the videos is, one, is clarity. It's like they filmed it with a potato. Of course, a lot of those videos are 10, 12 years old. Two, when you're looking at a leak down tester, there's two different types of leak down testers and two different gauge setups. So actually knowing, you know, what percentage leaking you're actually leaking into the engine could be totally different between two different tools. So I want to try and clarify that a little bit. So I'm going to go set the camera up so we can get started on this deal. Now, just to touch on the baseline tune-up on this setup just a little bit, I'll go over what was specified for me to start with from Good Vibrations. Typically, your nozzles in the hat are symmetrical side to side, but it is not uncommon for them to be staggered one way or another front to back. Now this tune-up here starts off with a 58 nozzle, 56, 56, and then a 50. And obviously they are the same on the other side. So that is, you know, your baseline jet area in the hat. Combine that with the pill that you have in the barrel valve here. That is determining how much fuel you're moving and where you're moving it to. Once you have that baseline established, really the next step is to set the butterflies. So I'm going to do that now. Typically you're going to see 10 thousandths to 12 thousandths air gap between the butterflies and the hat. So I'm going to grab a feeler gauge and jump up there and double check that. Mine should be set at 10. I have it marked here. I haven't really changed that since the other engine, but I should double check it, and that's what I'm going to do first. Now, I would suggest rather than use a 10 thousandths thick feeler gauge and try and check your clearance on these butterflies, my feeler gauges are about 1/2 inch wide, and it's not a flat area that you're actually checking that air gap. So I like to use two thinner feeler gauges paired up. So what I have right here is a number 5 and a number 6, which obviously is 11 thousandths clearance. Those two thinner feeler gauges actually work a little better to, you know, kind of conform to this round surface that the bores of the throttle blades actually creates. So all I'm doing is making sure that I can fit that 10 thousandths, 11 thousandths in this case, in between the throttle blades or the butterflies and the bore that they fit in. Now just because I can drop it in here and drag it out, that doesn't mean anything. You can actually lift that butterfly open just a little bit. And this butterfly on this end does seem a little bit snug, but it's definitely not enough to worry about. To change the difference in those, you'd have to loosen these 3 screws and kind of recenter or readjust that particular throttle blade. But it's really close. I'm going to say that I don't have to adjust those. I'm going to call those good. Now that I have the throttle blades set, we can move on to the barrel valve. The reason you want to set those throttle blades first is because as you move the throttle blades, you're actually moving this barrel valve. And that is what we are adjusting, is this distance right here. And that distance changes where that spool is in correlation to these ports in here. Now the first thing you're going to do is block off all of the ports in the barrel valve except for this line that is feeding your distribution block. Some people recommend that you remove this line completely, as the flow through the nozzles actually could change your leak down. I have found that once you get close, if you open this up, go to full flow in the spool, if your leak down goes to 0 or 100% leak down, you don't need to worry about this causing an issue at all. If it doesn't do that, then it would probably be a good idea to go ahead and remove this line, leave it open. But you do want to have the rest of your ports blocked, which the only other port on this particular setup is my return for the idle poppet. With all of my ports plugged, I can go ahead and hook up my leak down tester. On one side of the leak down, we've got incoming air or shop air, which I'm going to regulate to 100 psi. On the other side of the leak down tester, it is plumbed into the inlet side of my barrel valve. And basically all we are doing is setting this to a recommended starting point. And it is just a starting point, nothing more, nothing less. This should get us to the point that we can fire the engine up. General rule of thumb for blown alcohol is 75% leak down. So if you're putting in 100 psi, you want 75% of that leaking through the spool into your distribution block and in turn through the nozzles into the hat. This is one of the areas that I've always felt could use a little bit more clarification. Depending on what leak down tester you have, you could get a different result or looking at a different reading on this second gauge. As I roll this gauge up, bring it up to 100 psi, if this thing was 100% efficient and there was no leakage, this dial will come up to 100 as well. That means that it is 100% efficient. Now, if we were to go to 75, like I said, general rule of thumb is 75% leak. Well, 75% here is you're only leaking 25% into the hat. So we're actually wanting to open this up until we leak 75% of what is coming in. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead, turn my air on, get my regulator set. Hopefully this doesn't get too noisy with the air blowing in here. Should still be able to understand what I'm saying. At least as good as some of the gibberish I've been trying to get out so far. So now we'll bring the air up. You can hear it leaking into the hat. Now we're at a regulated 100 psi, and that is just, putting everything on a plane. 100 is 100%. That's why you're shooting for that number. As you can see, as it's sitting right now, we are at, looks like this needle is just over 50%. So that means we are leaking just under 50% into the hat. Now I'm going to open that barrel valve up, open the birdies up, which should go full flow. So that's going to mean that we're holding back, or it's less efficient. So this is going to drop off to 0, meaning 100% of this air, incoming air, is leaking into the hat. So that's telling me, according to your baseline or the general rule of thumb, This would be starting out pretty lean at this point. Now, just using some common sense, as you open this up, you can see this arm here moves down. So to richen the barrel valve and get us over here to 75% leakage, you're going to want to make this turnbuckle here, in a sense, longer. So I'm just going to turn this a little bit at a time, and you can see how minimal movement on this turnbuckle, how much it moves that needle on the secondary gauge. A really common term that you will hear the old guys talk about when adjusting the barrel valve is, guys will say, give it a flat. Give it a flat or take a flat away. They're talking about the flats of this turnbuckle. So let's do a little experiment and see just how much a flat equates to on the leakage. So I'm going to go ahead and fatten it up one flat. Currently we really should get somewhere out of that bubble. Let's go to 70% leakage, which is 30 on the gauge. I'm just going to go straight to there to start with. It looks pretty close from my angle. Oh yeah. So I'm going to give it one flat, rich. One flat, just changed that 2.5%. Kind of cool to know. So we need to go another flat to be at 75% leak. And we're about 24 there. That's good. It's 24, 25. That should actually be 75% leak through the barrel valve. Now, some of you have probably actually seen a leak down tester that has this secondary gauge where the numbers are on it backwards. And that's what I had mentioned earlier, where there could be some confusion there. You have to kind of do a little deducting yourself and figure out what you've got going on. But usually the ones that the numbers are on the gauge backwards, they're usually in a percentage. Then that's a lot more clear for someone that's trying to do this stuff, especially starting out. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and give it a couple of throttle bumps and make sure that that returns back to our 75% leak. Also, we can see it goes to full zero, so I don't have to worry about any of my nozzles causing any issues with my leak there. Pretty much right back there, that 24, which I shouldn't say 24, that's just adding to the confusion. It's actually 76% leak. What I'll do now is lock that bottom jam nut on that turnbuckle, make sure there's no major change there. That's just wiggling a little bit of play in that arm there. That could be as much as this jam nut here not being tightened down. I will suggest that if you're doing any tuning, once this thing is running, and you have to, when you get to adjusting your barrel valve with this thing running, run this thing up, maybe put a little piece of tape on it or something. The vibration of the engine and everything running, you get to fighting with trying to keep these jam nuts up out of the way while you're trying to make small adjustments. That can just infuriate a guy. I'm going to put a small piece of tape on there. I'll have this jam nut in place once I get fired up and do the fine tuning. Like I said, this leak down here is just a baseline. Once you get the engine fired up and running, you're going to come in here and play with this. Your fuel mixture in idle can change everything from pyrometer temperatures, idle speed. This is probably the most important tool at idle that you're going to mess with, is this piece right here. If you get it too lean, you'll actually get a cough or a hiccup. If you get on the throttle, it'll go lean immediately. If you're too rich, you can saturate your oil, just fill it clear full of alcohol, have fuel running out the pipes, putting out holes. All the magic happens right here at idle on this deal. I just noticed as well, we're under 100. My compressor out there is struggling to keep up. So I'm going to bump that back up and double check. Yeah, that puts us right back up, right about where we want to be there. Most certainly close enough to fire this thing up and get started. Now I have a couple other small things before I fire this up. I'm going to go ahead and get everything put back together on the barrel valve and the fuel system, but I am going to drain the fuel because that also is 4 months old, and change these spark plugs. These are -10 spark plugs, so they're probably the coldest plug that I have on hand. They were the only new ones I had when I put the engine together. I have a set of -9s, which are 1 stage hotter plug. I'm going to go ahead and put those in, and hopefully that helps the situation where I had a couple of cylinders a little on the rich side, or they weren't really firing like they should. So I'm going to get to work on that. I won't bore you with all that stuff. I'll just set the camera back up once I get done with all of that stuff. I wanted to go ahead and throw this on the video as well. What I did was hooked up another gauge in line here on the feed line that we were leaking through. This is a low pressure gauge, and what I did before I hooked my gauge up, I took that cap off of our idle poppet. So as you can see, we've got 100 PSI, and it is maintaining at about 6.5 PSI on this gauge. Another thing to note, as you can see, our leak down is way up there. We're leaking about, just a little over 90%. Well, that's because this is wide open, and that is why you make sure all of your fittings are capped off. Now I can get to work on the other stuff. This right here is my spare Enderly 110 fuel pump. Just exactly how I got it back from Enderly. I bought this one used on eBay, went ahead and shipped it into Enderly and had them freshen it up, go through and make sure all was good. If I remember right, the only thing they said they had to do to this one was replace an O-ring, and then they flow tested the pump. So the guy that sold it to me wasn't lying when he said it was freshly rebuilt. And as I mentioned before, when you get your pump back, you will get a flow tag. And these numbers are really important when you start talking to somebody about a tune-up. As you can see here, 4,000 RPM, that is camshaft speed. So at 8,000 RPM on the engine, on the crankshaft, this thing is 13.3 gallons per minute. That's actually a really good number. This pump here, I believe, is advertised as a 13 gallon per minute pump. The one that's on the truck now is 13.2. So this is making good flow. So anyway, now you understand this is very important information. Well, as you can see, it starts and it moves again. So that is a huge step for me. I was able to pull the truck out, do a little loop around the driveway there, and then back it back into the shop, more centered, give me some more room on my other workbench over there. Before pulling the truck out of the shop, I did spend a bit of time playing around, you know, double check the timing. I messed with the barrel valve a bit, and it's kind of interesting because when I fired it up, it was extremely rich, which is kind of to be expected when you set your barrel valve leak at 75%. So I got up there and just kept taking a flat after a flat after a flat away from the thing, because my front two cylinders actually get pretty hot. It's like they're lean, and the back two cylinders are really cold, like they're extremely rich. And it's the same, you know, left and right side of the engine. So I just kept taking fuel away because you could hear that it was rich. It's just kind of blubbery in the back four cylinders. By the time I got it leaned out enough that it was, you know, not really putting the fire out in the back four cylinders, the front four cylinders are, you know, they're manageable. They're a little warm, but not terrible. Nothing I need to worry about at idle. But I just thought it was interesting after all of the stuff that we've done. You know, I've changed to a different spark plug. I bumped the idle pressure just up just a touch, and then went through the barrel valve, made sure everything was good there. I also drained all of the bad fuel, or what I think may possibly have been bad fuel, replaced it with new fuel, and after all the playing around, I put the leak down tester back on the barrel valve and just double checked it, and it's at the exact 48% that I showed you what we started with. So that's kind of interesting. Now I have to say, this is the first time I've ever played with this particular type of blower. This is an open bottom blower. The other blowers that I've had before are a high helix delta opening blower. So in that situation, to start from the beginning, basically a blower inherently forces the air and the fuel forward, or at least the air. It forces the air forward in the blower case. That's just the nature of the beast. That's just how it works. So with a high helix delta opening blower like I've used before, the bottom of the blower actually has like a pie-shaped opening. They call that a delta opening. The thing with that is when you have that small opening in the front of the blower, that is where all of the air and all of the fuel that is coming through the hat, through the blower, enters into the manifold. So typically on my other engines, my other blown engines, the front two cylinders are extremely cold. They're fat. That is because all of that fuel is going into the front two cylinders. And then they progressively get warmer towards the back. Now the 547 that was in the truck, I had to do the same thing. I would lean that thing out so far that the back cylinders were getting, you know, extremely hot, you know, 800-900 degrees at idle, just so I could get the front cylinders to fire, you know, instead of just being completely flooded. Now here, obviously, I have basically the complete opposite problem. My front cylinders are the hot ones and the back ones are cold. Now this blower should still inherently force the air forward, and my nozzles in the hat progressively go from richer at the front to leaner at the back. All of this should indicate that I should have plenty of fuel at the front. But I've got a theory, and I'm starting to think that this thing being an open bottom blower, I'm wondering if it's still forcing the air to the front of the case, to the front of the manifold, just like it should inherently. But maybe being an open bottom blower, the fuel is falling out of suspension at the back of the case. Is it forcing the air at the top of the blower, at the inlet of the blower? Is all of the air and the fuel going to the back of the blower and then being, you know, driven forward in the case? But as doing so, the fuel is falling out of suspension, causing the back of the engine to run rich. And now the front is getting fuel. It is getting fuel and running, but it is also getting more air because of the blower inherently forcing more air to the front of the manifold. I don't know, just something to ponder. I'm gonna have to think about that a bit, mostly because I'm unfamiliar with this type of blower. I'll get it sorted. It's just gonna take a little bit of time. Like the last video, I'm gonna jump in at the tail end of this one. Over the past week, I've been talking to a couple of different people. Some of them are blower guys, some of them are fuel injection guys. And I've come to the conclusion that maybe I don't have quite all the information that I need for this particular setup. You know, earlier in the video, I had mentioned that inherently the air and fuel move through your supercharger from the back to the front. which with my 1471 that's on the 547, that is absolutely the case. It is a delta opening high helix blower, and it has no choice, no other option but to discharge out the front of the blower. This particular supercharger here, that may not be the case. I'm not really sure. What I am sure of is there's going to be a mechanical fuel injection video part 2. So I'm going to end this video here, but I have more parts and more things that I want to try with this setup. And that's what I'm going to do in the next shop video for sure, is tackle this thing a little deeper. Now, the way the truck is set up and running right now, it actually really runs pretty good. I think I could go out there and take a couple of pretty good throttle hits and it would be fine. But I'm really looking for that last 10%, as they say. I want it to run really good. I want it to run better than the average setup that just gets slapped on there. So that's what I'm shooting for. Like I said, I have more parts coming and we have more video to make. But for right now, all I can say is thanks for watching and have a good one.